Hello, thank you everyone for coming today. And before I get started, I'd first like to acknowledge that this is a beautiful day from the unceded territory of the Secwepemc people within Secwepemcúlecw. I am so grateful to be living on this land where teaching, learning, and research have happened for thousands of years, and I'm glad for my small part on it. My presentation is called A Drop in the Bucket, Academic Librarian Wellness During COVID. I'm presenting today, but I did have other collaborators in this study who couldn't be here today, Nicole Ava and Mary Greenshields. So I'd like to start off with atmosphere, because the COVID-19 pandemic that we are still experiencing in June 2022 is by and large quite different than how we were experiencing it in early 2021 when these interviews took place. At that point, it had been just about a year working from home. The vaccines were on the horizon, but still not really yet quite a thing. Most of us were at least starting to get over that productivity phase of early COVID. I made sourdough, I journaled, I went for a long walk every day. But at least for me, there wasn't really anything that quite replaced that. And what was happening to our work? What had happened? What was going to happen? I work in a mid-sized library in a bit of a unicorn job, a portion of which involves e-resource troubleshooting. But as soon as COVID hit, basically that was my job. I spent hours communicating with vendors and IT for all sorts of tiny problems sprouting up or being discovered, because that was library access now. And it was mind-numbing and draining. And I was also now a stay-at-home parent and a default teacher. And I didn't know what was going on in the library and the university and the larger scale. I had a lot of thoughts, a lot of feelings, and not a lot of people to share them with. So we talked to people. Myself, Nikki, and Mary, in total, we interviewed 19 academic librarians from across Canada about their work during the pandemic. They were fairly long interviews, 30 to 60 minutes generally, so I can only cover a small portion of our findings in this presentation. Wellness reared its head in various ways, from commentary on university-led wellness initiatives to discussions about what actually made participants feel good and hopeful during this time. So I'm going to talk about what we found in relation to wellness, but I also want to be clear that doing this research was, for me, an act of wellness. And so I want you all to feel free to share your COVID work experiences in the chat throughout the presentation. Whether or not it's related to something that I say, just whatever you'd like to get off your chest, I want to encourage you and support you in doing so. So I'm going to touch on various wellness-related topics from the interviews, and I'll try to minimize the overlap in what I've said before. I think the first thing we have to talk about is stress, which, assuming we all agree that the last few years have been on a constant stress roller coaster, this will be very much like a snapshot from one specific moment of that ride. The reasons we're stressing out now about COVID, about our jobs, about the world are distinct from the ways we were stressed out in March 2020, and those are distinct from how our study participants framed their stress in March and April of 2021. I want to talk about remote work, which, like a lot of other topics in our study was quite the double-edged sword. And by the way, if anyone has any ideas for non-military metaphors we can sub in for double-edged sword, please drop those into the chat, because I use that one so much. Similar conditions experienced very different ways. We'll talk about official wellness initiatives, both ones that came down from the higher ups, either a university administration or library administration, for the supposed benefit of library workers, and library wellness initiatives directed at students that some of our participants planned and or executed. And then finally, we will discuss what made our study participants feel good at work during COVID, because it was pretty much only one thing. So first, stress. So quick sidebar, up until now, Nikki and I have been doing these presentations together. She had a conflict and she couldn't be here today. So I put this one together on my own, and we've kind of been moderating influences on each other. So where she or I could be like, maybe this quote doesn't quite get at it, and together we winnow it down. But today you just have me, and there's no one to help winnow. So all these quotes are my favorite children, and I couldn't choose. I don't think there's anything on this slide that will be new or surprising information, but I do feel that there's a measure of catharsis in seeing these words from others. The pandemic was really stressful, and the stress of living through the pandemic couldn't be partitioned off and put away from the other things in our lives, including work. So this is what our participants had to say. What pushed me to my limit was all the other stuff, right? It was caring for my children, just the stress of living in a pandemic. Then the next person, I think about this as, okay, am I stressed out and feeling exhausted and just depleted because it's COVID and it's the world? Or because all this stuff is new and it's learning and it's screen time and it's exhausting. And so, yeah. And finally, you're dealing with the stress of being in a pandemic, right? And the toll that it takes. And so you just don't maybe have the same kind of bandwidth to deal with your regular stress. It feels even more. But here's the thing. These kind of life stressors are happening to us and or the people around us all the time. This is just arguably the first time in our work lives that something huge has happened to the whole world simultaneously in a way that work wasn't able to ignore. About a quarter of our study participants told us about complicating circumstances in their personal lives that they had to deal with privately while also living through the pandemic. And if COVID hadn't been happening, they would likely have been expected to come into work like nothing was wrong. Many of our participants were feeling a lack of motivation or specifically referenced burnout. Some examples here. This person says, on a bad week, I've got my work laptop in front of me and I'm just staring into the abyss and nothing happens, but I'm technically at work. So the next person said, I hadn't really thought about that before. That emotional work was hard. It's hard. And the last person, I feel burnt out, mostly on the emotional level because of seeing things happen and not being able to do anything about it, or seeing things not happen and not being able to have influence or power to affect positive change has been very challenging. And it's taking a toll on me in a lot of ways. And this is my own problem to deal with, but it has been a lot of emotional labor. It occurred to me when I was preparing this part that one of the things I personally like to do when sharing these results is to pick quotes that really seem to contrast one another, but there's no contrast to this. Certainly not everyone expressed burnout in such stark terms, but there wasn't anyone that we interviewed who said yeah, I'm feeling really great right now. This is an amazing professional moment for me. Probably the most common factor participants connected with stress throughout the interviews was uncertainty. It's frequently mentioned with fear, dread, frustration, anxiety, and chaos, like in this quote. It was like, okay, is this going to be a couple of days, going to be for a couple of weeks? And then of course, here we are a year later, still working from home. So yeah, there was just a lot of unknown and basically, thoughts around what do we prepare for? Yeah, just general feelings of not knowing what's going on and a little bit of dread and, impending doom, But here's the interesting thing. Uncertainty loomed large over two topics in our interviews. Discussions of the initial library closures and the pivot to online in March 2020, and in the discussions of what were then mostly forthcoming return to work and library reopening plans. And there was difference. When people talked about March 2020 and the initial library closures, the uncertainty was the stressor. It was fear, it was anxiety, it was not knowing if we were closed or open, or generally what was happening. Our participants largely evoked an overwhelming sense of anxiety brought on by not knowing at this time. No surprise, right? When later in the interviews, we talked about library reopening plans, uncertainty reared its head again, even more so with almost all of the study participants expressing uncertainty about reopening plans and any role they might have. But whereas the uncertainty around the closures was rife with panic, this time it was more likely ambivalent or resigned. And I don't think that the stress from the uncertainty just went away, but participants seemed more inured to it. like it had moved into the background. So wellness as a concept did not really come up explicitly in relation to remote work, but I think it's important for context to discuss the erosion of boundaries that almost all participants noted in relation to their work life and their home life. So there's sort of two sides going on with work from home. There's this one side of erosion of boundaries where work is in your home. And so like the person in the first quote, I can roll out in my sweatpants and sit down and just start working. I love that. This could have been a quote directly from me. I do love that. And there were advantages for parents like this person who says, I pick my son up from school every day. And so I have a half hour blocked in my calendar where I zip out and pick my son up. And that's like, I'm considering that my lunch break. That could have also been for me, except I have a daughter instead of a son, but no, I do that. And people without kids, I'm actually able to concentrate and work so much better at home. I'm home alone all day and it's glorious. And if there was one thing no one missed, it was probably the commute, like this person. I've just gotten used to like not commuting, which is great. And, you know, being able to take the dog out during the day. And finally, there were a couple of participants relieved to be escaping a toxic work environment. You know what? I've super enjoyed the privacy that comes from this. So nobody else in the department is watching me come and go. And it's been part of this need for a cultural shift in that it was pretty toxic. And I'm tired of that in the workplace. So lots of different advantages. But then we have the other side. On the other hand, your home is at your work. So this first person says, it's not necessarily that I feel less productive. It's just that I get way more distracted because my partner's also working from home. And so he's coming in and my cat's around doing things and eating toxic plants. Just shit happening, right? Like parents are calling me, and because not a lot of people understand, I think, what academic librarians do to begin with, but definitely not when they're working from home. So you just have a lot of distractions and interruptions in general. Honestly, that one could have also been for me. And then this next person, first of all, I'm always at work, right? I mean, the laundry is right there. So, and I do the laundry in the house. And so I'm never away from my desk or whatever. So yeah, never being away from work. It doesn't give you that transition. Doesn't let you say, okay, now I'm not at work anymore. I'm not doing that. I'm doing something else. And there isn't, in addition to that, there isn't the break. There isn't the interruption. I am always at work, but also there is no transition from I'm at work. Now I'm alone in my car or on a bike or on a bus, whatever. And now I'm at home. And now home is home. So it's the fact that you never leave, but also there is no transition to allow you even mentally to say, well, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm doing something else. Participants talked a lot about in-home distractions that in many cases lessened as the pandemic went on, with kids going back to school and partners returning to the office. But that lack of mental transition that people talked about seemed more likely to persist, from missing lunch to just looking up and suddenly it's 7 p.m. and you haven't stopped. People mentioned feeling more of an expectation to make their presence felt, both from their own managers and supervisors and from colleagues, and honestly from themselves as well. So wellness initiatives. These came in two flavors for our participants: internal wellness initiatives within the library aimed at employees, and the wellness initiatives crafted by librarians aimed externally, primarily at students. Both of these came up sporadically in our interviews, and the reactions from participants were very similar. So first of all, I want to talk about those internal wellness initiatives aimed at employees. And I will say, for the sake of transparency, that one person that we interviewed said frankly that they really appreciated these. So the type of sentiment I have displayed with these quotes was overwhelming, but not universal. So the first quote says, I'm less willing to buy some of the BS like productivity stuff and the self-care that like I myself peddle sometimes, Because a yoga at lunch does not do a lot when you are scared for your health and the health of your family. Like, that's a drop in the bucket, right? But this constant imperative to like produce, no matter what situation you're in, no matter what stress you're under, like, I don't want to be part of that anymore. So that's that. This was the quote that I thought really summed up the attitude that most people had. The wellness initiatives are a drop in the bucket that don't create or facilitate real change or improvement. And there's also a sense here that the BS productivity and self-care stuff is ignoring or even exacerbating those issues. Like that,
you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you. Like that maybe it should be okay that things are terrible and your workload is bursting if only you do enough yoga or like take a bath with a book to relax. And I think that there has been a lot of unconscious acceptance of this self-care approach. And what we saw in these interviews was that facade kind of breaking down. And I've included the next quote because there were real things that the participants wanted to do with easing their workload. And it was those efforts that didn't seem to ever come. So this next person says, and I was looking ahead at my schedule this week and I saw it said workload interview. And I thought for a second that my supervisor had booked me in for a conversation to talk about my workload. And I felt like this immense relief and like, oh, they care. That's so nice for them to check in about this. And then I realized what it was. And I was like, oh, that's funny. My supervisor checking in about workload. What a dream. Rather than understanding or easing workloads, most participants saw library or university administration attempt to cultivate positivity and cheerfulness. And this third quote suggests a bit of toxicity to that positivity. So this person says, and there are other initiatives like higher upper level administration sending out dumb jokes regularly, telling us to let our feelings hang out and sending these motivational messages. And it was just, it's a pandemic. I'm not having an awesome time. And then there was the other side of wellness initiatives, the one that librarians in our study were charged with, aimed mostly at students. And these were largely virtual versions of in-person events that in many cases had been popular or well attended and were things that participants had been very proud of in the past. So how did they work out? So this first person says, we would have things like unstudy spots or maybe a therapy dog come in. And so it's like, well, how do you translate that into the online space? We just kind of found that, or at least what I'm finding along with some of my other colleagues, and then I'll tell you what administration thinks, students are overwhelmed. And I think that after spending your whole day or whatever it is online in classes, they might not really want to spend another hour online in a Zoom room with people they might kind of know or might not. So there's a couple different things worth talking about here. First, there's the allusion this person makes to what administration thinks. And we heard this from this person and others, that there was pressure from administration to keep up that library presence and do virtual versions of the old activities, something to put on an annual report, was a quote from a different participant. There was a lack of recognition of the amount of work required for the impact. The second thing worth talking about here is that unlike the in-person versions, there's a sense that students didn't want those things. Our second participant would seem to concur with that, and I'm going to skip the quote because I know I'm pressed for time now. There's an additional implication here that these workshops, events, they were intended to promote wellness, were actually having the opposite effect. That this just one more thing was adding to rather than easing student burnout. Okay, so finally, we have arrived at what actually made our participants feel good and hopeful and positive or supported and generally well during a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad time. Because there was pretty much only one thing, and it was repeated over and over by the participants. In a time where many were mourning the death of chit chat and interoffice banter, and virtual modalities were seen as a barrier to relationships, many of our participants talked about real deepening connections with their colleagues that saw them through this time more than anything else. I have a number of quotes that I'd like to share about this, and I've given them each a slide of their own to let them breathe. So first, it's almost like not so much misery loves company, but we're in this boat together and we're trying our best to keep each other afloat and have realistic expectations of our projects And I'm actually quite lucky that some of my colleagues live very close. And so we, back in the summer, we could actually meet up at a park and maybe even discuss work. It was actually very pleasant. Now, being with the same team where we have a full team and we're seeing people that are, able to work and stuff, and just feeling the alleviation and relief of having redacted colleague. Yeah, she's kind of like a bomb. So our team, like me and my other colleagues, I would say we've actually grown much closer to one another. We were always close and worked really well together. And I think we all really enjoy each other as people. But they became some of the only people, aside from my immediate family and my mom and my dad, that I talk to on a weekly or even more frequently basis. So I think it became a real lifeline for people, this team. We really leaned on each other, and that was one of the things that has been kind of good. I feel really like they're such wonderful colleagues. I feel really grateful to have them. And finally, I feel like the thing that COVID has really heightened for me personally, and what I've seen for some of my other colleagues as well, is that I think the last year has really shown how much of our work necessitates elements of care and supporting people. So not only thinking about supporting the folks in our community, faculty, students, and stuff like that, but supporting our coworkers and recognizing that people are more than workers. People have complex and challenging lives. And I feel too that so much of the work that I have found really gratifying in the time of COVID, but also challenging, is because we're all virtual. That care work or that care elements looks different and sometimes is more difficult to deliver. I said at the beginning that I saw this work and I took on this work as an act of wellness. Talking, listening, and commiserating with other librarians was the most positive step I could take during a time when there wasn't a lot of positivity to draw from. And now that it's over, I wonder about my own capacity for pursuing wellness. More specifically, what happens when you get to the point where you don't have it in you to take a deep breath and step up for things that you know will make you feel good and proud? And I worry about this year as things revert to more like what they used to, about what happens when we don't get a break or a time to process, because I know I'm not the only one who hasn't had that. And I said at another conference that I really want to muster up the effort to do this again, to talk to all the people we talked to last year and ask them about what's happened since. Did things get better, worse, the same? And I would love that. And it would make me feel really great, but I don't think I can do it. So I want to say that to the extent that you are able, focus on those connections that foster wellness, these moments of vulnerability, of being in the boat together, of commiseration. They will help carry you through far more than positive thinking sound bites. I'm probably out of time. I'll be happy to answer questions whenever the question portion is, or even just listen if you want to share a COVID-related thing that happened to you. Thank you very much for being here and for listening.
Thanks so much, Amy. You did go over time a little bit, but I was just too interested to cut you off. So we do have 5 minutes left for questions. If anyone wants to pop some into the chat or the Q&A. I have ideas to start us off. Oh, looks like we do have a question. Okay, so Carly says, did you hear from any librarians who had to work on site throughout the pandemic? Did their experience differ?
No, actually everyone who we interviewed was working from home. One of the things that were out of scope during the study is we decided that it was only going to be people in librarian positions. And a lot of people talked about when their libraries reopened, the non-MLIS, non-librarian library workers had to go in, and their experience would have been a lot different. And I really, really hope that somebody does that project as well. It's just, if we had included that type of work, I think we would have got just a too big scope. Mm-hmm. That's a project that I would have liked to have done as well.
Yeah, important to keep scope in mind, I guess. Someone mentions being back, I am still exhausted. Recognition of feeling more exhausted when looking at previous routines. You've got some thanks, some agreement that our colleagues did help through all of this. So my question, I guess, so it did seem like management was pushing positivity when in reality people wanted to acknowledge kind of the difficult times that we were going through and are going through and being vulnerable with each other. So did you talk to any of your participants about how they could have better been supported by management, and like maybe if management could have, I don't know, encouraged these kind of more relational type coping strategies?
I mean, I think there's encouraging relational type coping strategies, but I don't think that's what people mostly wanted from their management. They, I've said in another presentation, and I'll say this elsewhere as well, that they wanted more communication, certainly, but there's also this whole contingent that I didn't talk about in this presentation about how pretty much we need less work. So what happened during COVID is that we put all of our work online, and now, and this is where I would love to go back, because what I'm seeing here is we're keeping some of those services, but also getting back our old services. And I don't think that largely what I see library administration, university administration, they don't take account for library infrastructure and the maintenance that it takes. You don't see a lot of university administrators with tech services backgrounds, and although some library administrators do, I don't think that it's the norm. So it's trying, more with less, more with the same. And I think, that is the I'm not thinking of the word, but you hear it every time, that there's, resilience and austerity and, pull up your bootstraps. But what I thought was interesting is, those regular narratives, but I do think that there was more resistance to it from the participants that we talked to. I forget what the original question was. I hope that was an answer.
That's okay.